wonder why inflation keeps going up? Here's why. Congressional Republicans might go on TV and whine about how the Democrats are causing it, and the Democrats might whine about how Putin's causing it, but they know the truth. They're doing it. There's a very specific reason why the prices at the grocery store continue to climb shockingly high and will not stop until our government stops doing one specific thing: printing. Until our government stops printing, that inflation rate that everyone's so aghast over will continue to go up and up and up. This should be the biggest story in the country right now, but nobody wants to talk about it. If the Fed is fighting inflation, it shouldn't be printing. Our Federal Reserve has promised to stop printing money, fake money. Every time it prints a dollar, the value of your dollar goes down because there's more of them. And the price of chicken in the grocery store, it goes up uncomfortably high. So we told the world, which depends on our dollars. After all, our dollar is the reserve currency. We told the world we'd stop. We've been promising to stop by March since last summer. We were just printing, we told the world, because of COVID, but it would stop. You could count on us. You could continue to use the dollar. It turns out we lied. Yeah, we did knock off in March for a whole 7 days when our balance sheet began to fall. But then we did the opposite of what we've been telling the world in all those press releases from the Federal Reserve. We kicked it back in high gear to a shocking level. And yet no one will talk about it. Even though day by day, week by week, your government is making you poor by doing this. Let me explain it quickly. How the federal government borrows money. Basically, they put out treasury bonds, and somebody pays $100 for the treasury bond. We promise to pay him back that $100 with interest. Well, we're spending like drunken fools, so there aren't enough treasury bond buyers on earth to satiate our desire for dollars. So guess what we do? A scheme so insane that if Bernie Madoff tried it, we'd have put him in prison. We put out treasury bonds. We know there's nobody to buy, and then we print the money and we buy them back. We did this so that we could afford to pay every American to stay home during COVID. And again, we promised the world we'd stop, but we haven't. In fact, we cranked it back up. In the week ending April 13th, the balance sheet held by the Fed grew by a staggering $27.9 billion in monopoly money, hitting a new record of $8.965 trillion. That's $3 billion more than the previous high in March. But you never know this to turn on your television. The Republicans blaming inflation on the Democrats, and the Democrats blaming it on Putin. And here's the scary part. Our government doesn't seem to be able to stop, and it's what's causing the inflationary records to be set. They're like drug addicts. The first step has got to be podcasts like this one to let people know what, and specifically who, is causing the pain. On my show, I was able to correctly predict that inflation would continue going up in the fall when everyone else was saying it was transitory. How'd I know? Congress had passed the $2 trillion infrastructure package funded by nothing. Absolutely nothing. That's how you knew inflation would keep soaring. They'd have to print money to pay for it. And they are right now. And you pay at the store in higher prices. And the jerks in Washington figure you're too stupid to ever figure it out. This is what must stop for the American people not to be impoverished by their government, the only culprit in any of this. Here's how Peter Schiff, chief economist and global strategist at Euro-Pacific Asset Management, put it. For all the talk of fighting inflation and shrinking its balance sheet, the Fed continues creating more inflation and expanding its balance sheet. Can you imagine if the American people understood this? And this, folks, is the name of the shell game. This is why the leaders of our country are virtually obsessed with keeping the Ukrainian conflict going. I've explained how they're deliberately doing it in previous podcasts. It's to cover for this. It's created this absolutely bizarre situation where everybody's reporting on, raising interest rates to get a hold on inflation. And the Fed spokespeople are coming out talking about how they're fighting it. And the Biden administration's talking about how they're fighting it. But they're not. Instead, the central bank, the Federal Reserve, continues to print money out of thin air to buy bonds. Folks, that's the exact opposite of fighting inflation. And you have to begin to ask yourself, what's the end game? Do they intend to stop? Or will they just let it all burn? Destroy the dollar? Folks, it was so bad. If you go back in these podcasts to the fall, you'll see one I did where Vladimir Putin tried to warn Americans that Washington was impoverishing them. Washington was bankrupting them. Washington was destroying their dollar. But we didn't listen. And so he commenced with the currency war he's promised us, with China at his side for 20 years. It's almost as if he feels bad about doing it. Like he wanted to warn us one last time before he took the dollar over the cliff. But then Putin's only taking advantage of an economic situation we're creating. It's Washington that's doing this. And why isn't anyone talking about it? Well, actually, they are. Economists on Twitter who've got bigger followings than CNBC and CNN business shows are screaming bloody murder about it. But the networks, they won't crack. They won't budge, assuming they even understand this, those talking heads. I just don't get it. But here's where we should be. At the end of the 1970s, the beginning of 1980s, in order to get a hold of inflation from all the printing we were doing, we had to take interest rates upwards to 20%. They should be at least 9% right now, and the Fed should stop printing. That's how we were able to get a hold of inflation in the 1980s. Instead, zero hedge rates, we continued to print money out of thin air to buy bonds. This is the exact opposite of fighting inflation. We shouldn't be seeing a growing balance sheet in the midst of historically high inflation, they write. Bingo! We should again be at 9-10% interest rates, and the printing should stop. Instead, they're cranking it, as they pound the Ukraine story again and again and again. Have you turned your TV on? It's surreal. All they want you to think about is Ukraine. And they want it to be huge, as if they want you to focus on that so it'll be big enough to you that you'll think that the way we live right now is because of Ukraine. And I'm here to tell you it's not. Now back to Vladimir Putin and his finance minister, who, along with the Chinese, has been holding weekly press conferences about the brand new economic system that they're building. Because, as they tell the world, the dollar's collapsing. You wouldn't want to be in it. You wouldn't want to have your reserves in it. You wouldn't want to buy energy in it. See, here's the problem. Right now, there's a very large, very fake demand for dollars because people perceive it as stable. So many countries keep their reserves in it. Cartels keep their reserves in it. People use it to trade, to buy businesses internationally. They buy commodities for it. 80% of oil is purchased in it. And Russia and China, like a drumbeat, are convincing the world, get out of the dollar. And a lot of people are going with them. This is why only half the world is sanctioned Russia for Ukraine. The other half wants to join the financial system they're making. You should hear the announcements. They're putting together their own credit ratings, credit rating agencies. They're putting together all kinds of trading platforms. They're ready to go. And at their side is Brazil and India and Indonesia and all of these other countries who want to flee the system based on our dollar. If we wanted to save it right now, we'd stop. We'd stop the printing press. We would balance our budget, even if just for a year or two. Folks, we live the way we live because we have the reserve currency. In that interview last week on my podcast with Wall Street Silver's Jim Lewis, he explained to us that dollar, as the reserve currency, goes away. And guess what? Right off the top, 20% of your lifestyle is gone. And that's just for starters. And yet, they won't stop. It's as if they can't stop. It's a thing of wonder. Now, why is nobody really covering in the mainstream media that if after all the promises to slow this down, it's called tapering, and that was very well covered, why aren't they covering that the printing press has been cranked back up? As Zero Hedge wrote, here's the reality. While the Fed is talking about fighting the inflation fire, it is still pouring gas on the inflation fire. Vladimir Putin correctly described this situation recently when he was talking about the economic war he's openly conducting on the United States. No one here ever covers this. Quote, he said, the growth of inflation, the deterioration of economic dynamics in the U.S. and European countries, the decline in the standard of living, the devaluation of their savings. It's an indictment of the way our leaders are making us poor. He's telling us he is taking advantage of it. He has bought massive stores of gold, and he's currently backing his currency, essentially, with it and oil. That's why the ruble is back to where it was when he invaded against the dollar. Bottom line, he's winning, and he doesn't understand why we want to lose and why we let our leaders do this to us.